Hello everyone, and welcome to Creepy Comfort. I know many of you use these videos to sleep, so before you slip into dreams, let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now get comfortable and relax, and let's begin. It started with a package. A small, unmarked box was left at my doorstep on a breezy autumn evening. There was no return address, just my name written in elegant, slanting script. I should have ignored it. I even hesitated as I picked it up, feeling the weight of something off. Inside, nestled in old, yellowed tissue paper, was a doll. Not just any doll, though. It was porcelain, its face painted with meticulous detail. Sharp blue eyes, flushed cheeks, and a subtle, almost mocking smile. The doll's hands were small, fingers bent into unnatural positions, and its dress, a faded lavender gown, seemed as though it belonged to another century. I didn't know who sent it or why, but curiosity got the better of me. That night, I placed it on the mantel in my living room, intending to investigate later. That first night, I didn't pay the doll much mind. It sat there, lifeless, its glassy eyes catching the faint glow of the table lamp. After a long day, I collapsed onto the couch, thinking I'd deal with the mystery of its origin in the morning. I woke up hours later to the sound of something creaking. At first, I thought it was the wind. The old house was full of quirks, but as I sat up and strained to listen, the creaking grew more deliberate, rhythmic. It sounded like footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from the living room. My heart raced as I tiptoed toward the sound. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, and when I turned the corner, the living room was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, except the doll. I was certain I had left it on the mantel. Now it was sitting on the edge of the coffee table, its legs dangling over the edge, tilted slightly, as if it were watching the room. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to rationalize. Maybe I'd placed it there and forgotten. Maybe someone else had moved it, though I lived alone. I picked it up, unsettled by how cold it felt, and placed it back on the mantel. The next day, I tried to brush off the incident. Dolls don't move. It's impossible. But by the following evening, my nerves were fraying. I kept catching glimpses of the doll in the corner of my vision, as if its head had turned slightly or its position had shifted. I tested myself. I positioned it on the mantel before heading to bed, marking its placement with a piece of tape. Felt silly, but I needed to know. At 3:07 a.m., I was jarred awake by the unmistakable sound of something shattering. I leapt out of bed, heart pounding, and ran into the living room. The lamp had been knocked to the floor, its bulb broken into jagged shards. The doll was nowhere to be seen. I searched the room in a frenzy, every shadow feeling like it was hiding something. And then I found it. The doll was sitting upright in the hallway, its small hand resting on the floor, as if mid-crawl. From that night on, the doll seemed determined to make its presence known. It never stayed in one place, no matter where I put it. Once, I woke up to find it sitting on the kitchen counter, its head tilted toward the fridge. Another time, it was perched on my bookshelf, one tiny hand outstretched toward the spines of my books. I tried locking it away, stuffing it into a box and shoving it in the closet. But every time it found its way out. By the third night, I started hearing whispers. They were faint, like a distant conversation just out of reach. Sometimes they were soft, almost comforting. Other times they were sharp and accusatory, sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know where this thing came from and why it was tormenting me. The thought of the doll moving by itself, whispering in the shadows, was too much to bear. I needed answers. I started digging through old family records, trying to find anything related to the doll. After hours of sifting through dusty boxes and brittle papers, I found something. It was a letter hidden in a folder that seemed out of place. It was dated back to the 1920s, written in the same elegant, looping handwriting as the one on the package. The letter was addressed to my great-grandmother, but it wasn't signed. The words in the letter were strange, rambling, like someone had written them in a frenzy. The doll must be passed on. It will never leave once it is with you. It waits for something. Do not let it move. I felt my stomach churn as I read. What did it mean? Was this doll cursed? And if so, what did it want? That night, I decided to confront the doll head-on. I placed it on the kitchen table, making sure it couldn't move, keeping a close watch on it. But the moment I turned my back, I heard it, soft, dragging footsteps. The doll was gone. I spun around in panic, but there it was, sitting on the windowsill, its eyes fixed on me. A cold smile etched on its porcelain face. I felt a chill spread over me, and for the first time since all this had begun, I wasn't sure I was ready to face what was happening. It was no longer just a doll. It was something far more sinister. Something that had been waiting for me, patiently, like a predator biding its time. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to get rid of it. I needed to destroy it before it could do more. But every time I reached for the doll, I felt something holding me back. It wasn't just fear. It was as if the doll itself had an influence over my actions. Desperation clawed at me. Maybe I could bury it, burn it, or even drown it. But nothing felt like it would be enough. Each plan I came up with seemed to make the doll stronger, more resolute in its movements, its whispers. And so, I was left with no choice but to return the doll to the place it had come from. I drove to the abandoned house where my great-grandmother had once lived. It stood at the edge of town, a decaying relic, its windows shattered and doors hanging loosely. As I walked through the overgrown yard, the whispers grew louder in my ears, swirling around me like a storm. When I entered the house, it was eerily silent. I could feel the doll's presence everywhere. I placed it in the center of the living room, setting it down gently on the dusty floor. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but no one was there. The room was empty, except for the doll. It was standing in the center of the room, eyes locked on mine, a malicious grin slowly creeping across its face. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The doll had been sitting motionless on the floor just a moment ago, but now it was standing. Its porcelain face had shifted, the smile now twisted, almost mocking. I stepped back slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about the way it stood there, like it was waiting for me, sent a wave of terror rushing through me. I turned to flee, but the door wouldn't open. My fingers gripped the handle desperately, but it wouldn't budge. I pushed and pulled, panic rising in my chest as the air around me grew colder, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The doll was coming toward me. I could hear its tiny feet dragging across the floor, its dress swishing in a slow, rhythmic pattern. I didn't dare turn around to see it, but I could feel its presence drawing closer. Then I heard a voice, a soft, almost childlike voice that seemed to come from all around me. "You shouldn't have come here." I whipped around, my eyes scanning the dark room. Nothing, no one, just the doll, standing perfectly still, its blue eyes gleaming in the dim light. The whispers continued. They weren't just voices now, they were memories. Images flashed in my mind. Flashes of my great-grandmother, a young woman, standing in this very room, holding the doll in her arms, her face twisted in fear. She was begging someone, anyone, to take it away, to end the nightmare that had started long before I was born. And then I understood. The doll wasn't just cursed. It wasn't just haunted. It was alive. It had been waiting for someone to return it, waiting for the right person, the right time. I ran. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Every step I took, I felt its presence behind me, following me through the house, as if it were alive, hungry, determined to claim me. The air grew heavier, suffocating, the walls closing in around me. I slammed the door open and stumbled out into the yard, gasping for breath. But when I looked back at the house, the doll was standing in the window, watching. I don't know how I made it home that night. My mind was a blur, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But even now, I can feel it. Its eyes on me, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for me to take it in again. It never stops watching. Now, let's move on to story 2. I thought I had escaped, but something far worse was waiting for me just around the corner. The house had been quiet for days. After what happened with the doll, I expected the worst, but nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. I tried to move on with my life, to pretend that the horrors of the past were just some twisted dream. But no matter how hard I tried to bury it, I could feel that weight, that sense of being watched, lurking just beneath the surface. I told myself it was just paranoia. After all, I had left the house that night, fleeing from the doll, fleeing from the terror, but the feeling never quite went away. The atmosphere felt wrong, like the house had absorbed the fear, and now it was suffocating me. It was on the 7th day, after I'd gone back to my daily routine, that it all started again. The first strange thing was the sound. It was faint at first, just a light scratching, like something small was moving across wood. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, an old creak in the floorboards. But it came again, and again, each time louder and more deliberate. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my nerves being on edge. But then I heard it, footsteps, not the soft shuffle of a mouse or the thud of something heavy, but the unmistakable sound of someone walking in the attic. Slow, measured, like they were testing each step before taking the next. I froze in place. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. No one lived with me. I had no family or friends nearby who could be in the house. I didn't even have an attic door that could be easily opened. So what was up there? The scratching continued, followed by another series of footsteps. Something inside me snapped, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was up there. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and made my way to the attic ladder. my hands trembling as I reached for the pull string. It felt like an eternity as I stood at the bottom of the ladder, staring up into the darkness. The house was eerily silent now. The footsteps had stopped, and the scratching had faded away. But the silence was deafening. It was like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I forced myself to climb the ladder. Each step felt heavier than the last, and with every inch I ascended, the air grew colder. When I reached the top and opened the hatch, a sudden, sharp coldness hit me. I shivered involuntarily, but forced myself to step into the dark space. The air was thick with dust, the smell of mildew heavy in my nostrils. The flashlight's beam cut through the shadows, revealing old boxes, forgotten furniture, and things I couldn't even begin to identify. But then I noticed something else. The scratching was back, a faint, rhythmic sound, like nails on wood. It was coming from somewhere deep within the attic, echoing through the shadows. My heart raced, the feeling of dread creeping in from every corner. The flashlight's beam flickered for a moment, casting everything in a wavering light. That's when I saw them. Eyes, dozens of eyes. They were scattered throughout the attic, attached to nothing, just eyes. Their cold, glassy stares fixated on me as if they knew I was there, knew I was coming. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I stumbled backward, almost losing my footing on the ladder. The flashlight flickered wildly before illuminating the rest of the attic in full. What I saw made my stomach twist. The eyes weren't just some freaky collection of old, broken dolls or abandoned trinkets. No, they were alive. At least they seemed to be. Each one glistened, reflecting the dim light of my flashlight in a way that felt far too real, far too purposeful. I swallowed hard and tried to steady my breathing. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the countless stares piercing the darkness. And then one blinked. It was slow at first, just the faintest flicker of motion. And then another blinked, and another. One by one, they began to move, their eyelids fluttering in a synchronized rhythm. A chill ran down my spine, and I bolted from the attic, slamming the hatch closed behind me with a force I didn't know I had. I backed down the ladder, barely able to keep my balance, my breath ragged and shallow. I had to get out of the house. I didn't even stop to grab my coat. I grabbed my phone from the table in a panic, dialing the first number that came to mind. My best friend, Rachel. She picked up after 2 rings. "Hello." Her voice was groggy. "What's wrong?" I need you to come over. Right now." My voice cracked, a sharp edge of panic cutting through the calm. "Okay. Calm down," she said, her tone soft but concerned. "What happened?" "I don't know," I said, voice trembling. "There's something in my attic." "Eyes, so many eyes. I need help." "Stay where you are," Rachel said, her voice firm now. "I'm coming over." I hung up the phone without saying another word, and before I even thought about it, I was already halfway down the stairs, pulling open the front door and running into the yard. The night air was cold and bitter, but it didn't matter. I didn't even stop to put on shoes. I just ran, each step carrying me further away from the house, as if distance could somehow shield me from whatever was waiting for me inside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty street. When I looked back at the house, I saw it. Something standing at the window. A figure. A silhouette. Its outline barely visible against the dim interior light, but its eyes, those eyes, still gleamed in the dark. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. My legs were frozen to the spot as the thing in the window seemed to watch me, its gaze never leaving mine. Then it blinked. I turned and ran faster, not daring to look back again. I didn't stop until I reached Rachel's house, my heart hammering in my chest. I pounded on her door, frantic. Rachel opened the door a moment later, her face filled with concern. "What's going on? What did you see?" I opened my mouth to explain, but all that came out was a gasp. The words were stuck in my throat. I didn't have the strength to speak them. I could still feel their eyes on me. Now let's move on to story 3. That was only the beginning. What came next would push me to the edge of sanity. I hadn't been able to sleep properly for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the eyes from the attic, staring at me from the darkness. They blinked, they watched, they followed me. I couldn't escape them. I thought that by leaving the house, by getting some distance between me and whatever was inside, I could feel safe. But I was wrong. I found myself back at the house, standing in front of it again, drawn by something I couldn't explain. Rachel had tried to convince me to stay at her place, to rest and recuperate, but the pull of the house was too strong. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. When I stepped back inside, the house felt different. It wasn't just the oppressive silence. It was the air itself, heavy, thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The faint, musty smell of mildew had returned, mingled with something else, something older, something foul. I tried to shake it off, but the unease settled into my chest like a stone. I walked slowly through the house, feeling the eyes of the walls on me. It was ridiculous. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that everything would be fine as long as I stayed calm. I had to confront whatever was in the attic. Couldn't let it control me. As I climbed the stairs, the creaking of the steps beneath my feet seemed to echo in the empty house. The sound was too loud, too sharp, like it was waiting for something to happen, something I couldn't see. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. The memories of the eyes came rushing back, but I forced myself to open it, to step inside. The attic was exactly how I'd left it. The old boxes were still there, stacked high against the walls. The furniture, covered in dusty sheets, sat untouched. The faint, cold draft still lingered in the air, sending a chill down my spine. But something was different. The scratching sound had returned, though now it was accompanied by a low, almost inaudible whispering. It was so faint I could barely hear it over the pounding of my heart. I slowly shined the flashlight around the room, feeling my breath catch in my throat as the beam landed on something new. There, on the floor, was a small piece of paper, crumpled and torn. I reached down to pick it up, and as I did, the whispering grew louder. "Come closer." I froze. The words were clear, unmistakable. The voice sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves, from deep within the house, as though the house had somehow come alive. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the attic, the flashlight trembling in my grip. There was nothing. just the same cold shadows that had always been there. But then I heard it, a faint tapping on the wall behind me, like a slow, rhythmic knock. Tap, 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 each one closer than the last. I spun around, but saw nothing. The tapping had stopped, but then I heard it again, this time louder, more urgent. The walls seemed to be alive, pulsing with each thud, each beat. The tapping was becoming faster, more erratic. I stumbled back, my feet tangling in the old boxes. My breath was ragged, and I could feel a cold sweat gathering at the back of my neck. I was trapped. I couldn't move. The whispering grew louder, the words now clearer, more distinct. Come closer. We've been waiting. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The floor felt like it was shifting beneath me, the walls groaning as if they were alive and pressing in from all sides. And then I saw it. At the far corner of the attic, near the old rocking chair, a figure stood. Its outline was blurry, almost distorted, but I could make out the faint shape of a person with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, its eyes never blinking, never shifting. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I felt paralyzed, my body refusing to obey as the figure inched closer. With every step it took, the walls seemed to close in tighter. The air grew thicker, suffocating. I knew I had to get out. My instincts screamed at me to flee, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was like it was pulling me in, like it was commanding me to stay. The figure raised its hand slowly, pointing towards me. The whispering came again, louder now, echoing in my ears. You belong to us now. In that moment, something snapped inside me. I bolted. I ran, not caring about anything except escaping that attic, that house. I could hear the figure's footsteps behind me, getting closer with each passing second. My heart thudded in my chest as I ran down the stairs, through the hallway, and to the front door. When I reached it, I pulled and pulled at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I turned around, panting, my mind racing. The whispering was all around me now. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the air itself. The figure was no longer just standing in the corner. It was there, in the hallway with me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. I tried to scream again, but still, no sound came. The whispering was so loud now, deafening, overwhelming. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. It was too much. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind, the door creaked open. Rachel stood on the other side, her face pale and terrified. She grabbed my arm, pulling me out of the house with a strength I didn't know she had. But even as we ran, I could feel it. The house was watching. The walls were whispering. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Now, let's move on to story 4. That was only the beginning. What came next would push me even further into the unknown. The moment we left the house, I felt a brief sense of relief. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air seemed to lift, and for the first time in days, I could breathe freely. But that feeling was short-lived. No sooner had we stepped outside than I felt a cold chill, like fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. It was as if the house was still there, pressing in on me, watching me. I kept my head down, walking quickly to Rachel's car, hoping that once I got in, I would feel safe. But the car was no sanctuary. I could feel the eyes. The same hollow eyes that had stared at me from the attic were everywhere. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, in the dark windows of houses we passed, in the shadowed corners of the streets. I could hear Rachel's voice, faintly asking me if I was okay, but it felt distant, like it was coming from underwater. My thoughts were consumed by what I had seen in that house, by the figure, by the whispering. It was all still so fresh, so real, that it felt like it was happening all over again. "Are you sure you're all right?" Rachel asked again, her voice cutting through my thoughts. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was telling the truth. "Yeah, just tired. Let's just get to your place." She didn't question me further. She just drove, her eyes on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I wanted to believe that the worst was over, that whatever I had encountered in that house would stay there, buried beneath layers of time and dust. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing ever is. When we arrived at her apartment, Rachel made sure I got inside safely before leaving. She'd been worried about me, about my behavior. I was distant, distracted, but I couldn't help it. Something had changed. Something inside me had been twisted. The moment I stepped through the door, the air in the apartment felt off. The usual coziness of Rachel's place had vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. I sat down on the couch, my mind racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes again, empty, dark, watching. They were always watching. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, they were there, lurking just beyond my vision. The house wasn't done with me. I tried to brush it off. I tried to sleep, to forget everything that had happened. But every time I drifted off, I felt it. The cold fingers of fear creeping up my spine, the whispers in my ears. It was like a presence was there, just beyond the reach of my senses, waiting to pounce. And then it happened. I woke up in the middle of the night, gasping for air. My skin was clammy, my heart pounding in my chest. It took me a moment to realize what had woken me, what had dragged me from the depths of sleep. A tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the pipes groaning in the walls. But the tapping grew louder, more distinct. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate. It was the same sound I had heard in the attic. I lay still, frozen in the dark, listening intently. The sound was coming from the other side of the room, from the window. I knew deep down that I shouldn't go near it. I knew that the moment I got up, whatever was waiting on the other side would see me. But curiosity, the kind that always seems to lead to disaster, pushed me to my feet. Slowly, I crept toward the window, my heart pounding in my ears. As I drew closer, the tapping stopped. A cold wave of dread washed over me, and for a moment, I stood there, not sure if I should look out the window. But the pull of whatever was out there, the need to know, was too strong. I slowly pulled the curtain back, the fabric dragging against the window frame with a sound that seemed far too loud in the silence of the room. I froze. There, standing on the other side of the glass, was the figure. Its hollow eyes were staring directly at me, unblinking, unseeing. I couldn't tell if it was smiling or if its lips were simply stretched too tight, but the expression seemed wrong, too wide, too twisted. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I wanted to run, to hide, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was stuck, rooted to the spot. The figure raised its hand, pressing its palm against the glass. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze burning through me, like it was searching for something deep inside. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared. One moment it was there, the next gone. But I could still feel it. I could feel its presence, lingering in the corners of the room, in the very air I breathed. I slammed the curtain shut, backing away from the window, my heart racing. I turned to look at the door, at the hallway, but there was nothing there. The apartment was still, silent, as if nothing had happened. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. I knew the figure was still out there, and somehow, I knew it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. Now, let's move on to story 5. The house might have been gone, but its shadow followed me to a place far darker than I could imagine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. It started in the days after the encounter with the figure outside Rachel's apartment. At first, I thought it was just the lingering effects of the terror I'd felt, a kind of post-traumatic paranoia that made every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind seem like a warning. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more it seemed real. I tried to ignore it. I had no choice but to carry on with life. Rachel had been kind enough to let me stay with her for a while after everything that happened at the house. I thought being in a new place with new surroundings would help me forget. But it didn't. At night, when I was lying in bed, I would hear the softest of sounds, whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls, or maybe just the neighbors being too loud. But the whispers never made sense. They weren't words, not exactly, just sounds, hushed tones, as if something was murmuring just beneath the floorboards, just out of reach. I told myself it was nothing, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They felt like fingers scratching at the edges of my mind, pulling at something I couldn't quite remember. I couldn't let it consume me, but every night they returned, and each time they grew stronger. One evening, after a particularly restless night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to investigate. I told Rachel I was going to check out the crawl space under the apartment, where I thought the sound might be coming from. She wasn't thrilled, but she didn't stop me. If anything, she looked relieved, as if she wanted to know what was happening just as much as I did. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way into the small closet where the trapdoor to the crawl space was hidden. The air inside was thick with dust, the stale smell of something forgotten. It was hard to believe anyone had ever been down there. The trapdoor creaked as I opened it, and I winced at the sound. The space beneath the apartment was low, barely enough for me to crawl through. The beam from my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the bare walls of the foundation, covered in old, decaying wood. But it was the sound that stopped me in my tracks. The whispers were louder now, almost too loud to ignore. They weren't coming from the walls, though. No, they were coming from beneath the floorboards themselves. I could feel them, like a pulse of energy vibrating through the floor. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, breathing, waiting. I took a hesitant step forward, the beam of light trembling in my hand. The whispers grew more distinct, like they were calling to me, begging me to listen. I pressed my ear to the floor, my heart hammering in my chest. The words were becoming clearer now, though still impossible to understand. I bent down, my fingers brushing against the old, rotting floorboards. The floor felt wrong, too soft, too pliable, like it was hiding something. I had to know what it was. I had to understand. With trembling hands, I began to pry up the boards. It was slow work, the wood creaking and groaning under the pressure, as if it didn't want to be disturbed. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as if they were rising up from the very depths of the earth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to pull up a section of the floor. Beneath it, there was a hole that seemed to go down into nothingness. It was like a tunnel, dark and endless, stretching far beneath the building. I could feel the coldness seeping out of the hole, a damp, musty air that smelled of decay. And then I saw it, the thing that had been waiting. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was more like a shape, a shadow without form, with long, writhing tendrils that seemed to reach for me, as if they wanted to drag me into the dark. The whispers, now louder than ever, filled my mind, drowning out everything else. They were voices, but not of any person I recognized. They were something ancient, something hungry. I froze. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The shadows seemed to reach out toward me, the air growing colder, heavier with every passing second. My breath came in short gasps, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the shadow pulled back into the darkness. The whispers faded, leaving me in an eerie silence. The hole beneath the floorboards was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking, my mind reeling. What had I just seen? What had been beneath the apartment? And why had it shown itself to me? I wanted to tell Rachel what had happened, to ask for help, but I couldn't. I didn't have the words. How could I explain what I had just encountered? How could I explain the terror that still gripped my chest? I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow, those tendrils reaching for me, pulling me toward the darkness. I could still hear the whispers, now haunting me even in my waking hours. And I knew, deep down, that the shadow wasn't done with me. It had shown itself once. It would return. I could feel it, waiting. Now, let's move on to story 6. That was only the beginning. What came next would push me to the edge of sanity. I thought I had seen the worst of it. The whispers, the shadows beneath the floorboards. I believed that was as far as the nightmare would go. But when I woke up the next morning, the house felt different. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing, the air heavier, thicker with an unsettling presence that lingered in every corner. I had tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream. Maybe the stress of everything had gotten to me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the strange occurrences weren't limited to the crawl space under the apartment. They were following me, creeping into my daily life in ways I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. I started hearing things moving in the apartment when no one was there, doors opening and closing on their own. The unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing down the hall when I was certain I was alone. And the worst part? I couldn't stop myself from checking. I would get up in the middle of the night, driven by an irresistible compulsion to investigate. Rachel noticed it too. She would often catch me staring at a door or walking into rooms with no real purpose. "You okay?" she would ask, concern edging her voice, but I never had an answer. How could I explain that something unseen was shifting around me, just beyond my reach? One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the apartment, I went into the living room to find Rachel sitting by the window. She was staring at the door, her expression distant. "Rachel," I asked, my voice trembling slightly. I didn't know what I was afraid of, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. She didn't answer immediately. When she finally turned to face me, her eyes were wide, unblinking. I heard something," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. It was coming from the hallway, but when I checked the door, it was open. A chill ran down my spine. My own fear suddenly felt validated. I knew exactly which door she was talking about. The one that led into the dark, and used hallway at the end of the apartment. It was always locked, always shut tight, but now it was ajar, just a crack. I turned to look at the door, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just open, it was slightly more than usual. Someone or something had nudged it open just enough to give a glimpse of the darkness beyond. "Rachel, you didn't open it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "No," she replied, shaking her head. "I swear, I didn't." I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, my mind racing. I had been hearing things, footsteps, whispers, but this felt like something more. A door that had always been locked, now open for reasons I couldn't explain. Against my better judgment, I took a step forward. I wanted to close it, to make it stop, to pretend like none of this was happening. But the door, it beckoned. I don't know what made me open it. As soon as I did, the air in the hallway hit me. It wasn't cold, exactly, but there was something off about it. A heaviness, like the very air had been waiting for something, for someone. And beyond that door, I could see a faint glow at the far end of the hallway. It was a sickly yellow light, flickering like a candle about to die. The kind of light you never see unless you're in a place that doesn't want to be seen. I stepped into the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my weight. Rachel followed close behind, her hand gripping my shoulder, a silent plea in her touch. I didn't want to turn back. Not yet. I had to know. The hallway stretched on, longer than it should have been. It was narrow, claustrophobic, with peeling wallpaper and faint scratches on the floor, like something had dragged itself across the wood. But the light at the end of the hallway, the one that seemed to pulse just out of reach, was drawing me in. It wasn't natural. It was like the glow had a life of its own, and it was waiting for us to come closer. As we walked deeper into the hallway, I felt it. The pressure in the air, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the sensation of being watched. Someone was here. We reached the end of the hallway, where the light was coming from an old wooden door. The door that had never been there before. I was certain of it. It didn't match the rest of the apartment. Too old, too warped, too strange. Rachel gasped behind me. "What is that?" I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking. It felt like it wasn't my own hand at all. Like something else was guiding me, pushing me forward. When I turned the knob, The door opened with a long, drawn-out groan. Beyond it, there was nothing but darkness. A void so complete, I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. Suddenly, I felt something pull me forward, a force stronger than anything I had ever experienced. A cold, invisible hand wrapped around my chest, dragging me closer to the void. I tried to scream, tried to call out to Rachel, but the air was thick, suffocating. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind screaming as I was pulled further into the dark. Rachel was shouting behind me, but I couldn't hear her. The world around me was fading, swallowed up by the darkness that now surrounded me completely. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pressure released. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor, gasping for breath. My heart was racing, my head spinning. I looked around, but the hallway was empty. The door was gone. The apartment was silent. Rachel was gone. I was alone. I didn't know what I had just encountered, whether it was the same force that had been haunting me all this time or something worse. But I knew one thing for sure. I had opened something that shouldn't have been opened, and now it was free. Now, let's move on to story 7. That was only the beginning. What came next would unravel everything I thought I knew. I couldn't stop thinking about the door, the one that shouldn't have opened. It lingered in my mind, haunting me in the quiet moments, during the few hours of sleep I managed to steal. Rachel was gone, vanished without a trace, and there was no explanation. No sign of a struggle, no clues to follow. The apartment had returned to its eerie silence, but something in me told me that it wasn't over. I had been looking for answers, searching every corner of the apartment, retracing every step from that night. But no matter how many times I checked, nothing ever made sense. The hallway had disappeared, the door was gone, and Rachel was nothing more than a memory, an imprint in the space she once occupied. The only thing left was the feeling that something was watching me. I couldn't shake the sensation that eyes, cold, unblinking eyes, were always present, even when I was alone. I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was never anything there. Except for that one night. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the silence in the apartment unnerving. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting long, jagged shadows on the floor. The clock on the wall ticked in the stillness, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. That was when I saw them. 2 eyes, pale, glassy and unblinking, staring at me from the corner of the room. They weren't human. They didn't belong to anything I had ever seen. They glowed faintly in the dark, like the reflection of headlights in the rearview mirror. But there was no car, no source of light. Just those eyes, unwavering, fixed on me. I froze, unable to move, my breath shallow. I blinked once, then twice, hoping that the eyes would disappear, but they stayed, locked onto me, watching with a kind of knowing I couldn't comprehend. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, unable to tear my gaze away. The more I stared, the more the eyes seemed to shift, as if they were moving. I couldn't tell how, but they were getting closer, inching forward from the corner. I grabbed for my phone, my fingers trembling as I tried to unlock it. Maybe I could call for help, or at least get a picture, something to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But the screen wouldn't turn on. The phone was dead. I glanced back at the corner, and the eyes were even closer now. There was no sound, no movement, just that cold, unyielding stare that seemed to pierce through me. It took everything in me to turn away, to look at something, anything, other than those eyes. I turned toward the window, hoping to find some comfort in the familiar sights of the city. But there was nothing. The world outside was dark, still. Not a single light flickered in the distance. When I looked back at the corner, the eyes were gone. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, some figment of my imagination brought on by the stress and the strange happenings over the past few weeks. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. There was something in that apartment, something that had been waiting for me to see it. Days passed, but the feeling of being watched never went away. I would catch myself glancing into empty rooms, expecting to see those eyes again. I couldn't escape them. They were always there, lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for me to turn my attention away for even a second. Then one night, I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to know what they were. I had to confront whatever it was that had been tormenting me. I set up cameras in the apartment, hidden in corners, behind furniture, anything I could think of to capture whatever was watching me. That night, I waited, sitting in the dark, watching the screens. Every minute stretched on, slow and agonizing, my eyes never leaving the feed. But there was nothing. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, the camera in the hallway flickered. I froze, leaning closer to the screen. The hallway was empty, just like the rest of the apartment. But then, just beyond the edge of the frame, I saw it. The faintest glimmer of movement. I rewound the footage, watched it again. There it was, a figure moving too fast to identify, its outline just a blur. And then the eyes, those pale, unblinking eyes, staring back at the camera. It was as if they knew I was watching. The screen went black. I rushed to check the camera, but it was gone. The footage, the entire system, everything was wiped clean, as if it had never existed. In the silence that followed, I felt something shift in the apartment. A presence, cold and heavy, like the air had turned to stone. The eyes were there again. Only now they were closer, far too close, just inches away from me. I could feel their gaze on me, like they were drilling into my skull, pulling every thought out of my head. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut before I could reach it. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the apartment stretched out, growing longer, darker, more oppressive. And then, through the silence, came a voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have looked." I spun around, but there was no one there, just the eyes, pale, cold, and endless, staring at me from every corner of the room. I didn't know how long I stayed there, locked in that nightmare. Time had lost all meaning. All I knew was that the eyes were always there, watching. They had never blinked, not once, and they never would. Now let's move on to story 8. That was only the beginning. What came next would draw me deeper into a mystery I couldn't escape. The house felt different now. The creaking floorboards, the distant echoes, the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. All of it had changed. At first, it had been a place of comfort, a refuge from the world. But now, each creak, each whisper, sent a chill through my bones. It all started after I found the trapdoor. I had been exploring the old house, as I often did when the nights grew long and the silence became unbearable. The house was centuries old, with strange little nooks and crannies that seemed to lead nowhere, forgotten spaces that most people wouldn't give a second thought. But I had always been drawn to the forgotten corners. I'd been living here for weeks, and yet I hadn't seen it all. That night, in the corner of the living room, behind the old oak bookshelf that had been there longer than anyone could remember, I noticed something strange. A small crack in the wood, barely noticeable at first. It was almost as if the bookshelf had shifted slightly, leaving a gap between it and the wall. I reached for it, half curious, half cautious, and pressed against it. The bookshelf creaked but didn't move. And then there it was, a faint outline beneath the dust, a small trapdoor hidden under the wooden floorboards. It had been there all along, quietly waiting to be discovered. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt down, brushing away the years of dust and grime that had accumulated. The trapdoor was old, its metal hinges rusted and worn. The wood was dark, weathered by time, and I could feel an unease rise within me. I was about to open something that had been sealed away for so long, but curiosity won out. I pried it open, my hands trembling, and peered inside. A set of wooden stairs spiraled downward, disappearing into darkness. The air that wafted up was stale, carrying the unmistakable scent of mildew and something older, something that didn't belong in this house. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight from the table and made my way down. The stairs groaned beneath my weight, each step creaking and protesting as I descended. The darkness seemed to press in around me, the beam of light cutting through it like a fragile thread. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't stop now. I had to see what was at the bottom. The space below was small, barely tall enough for me to stand upright. But the walls were covered in something strange. Scratches, deep gouges that marred the old wood, as if something had been clawing at the walls, desperate to escape. The floor was littered with broken shards of glass and old, yellowed papers, their contents unreadable. I stepped deeper into the space, my heart racing as the air grew thicker. The whispers started then, soft at first, a faint murmur, like the sound of wind rustling through dead leaves. I paused, straining to listen, but there was no breeze. The room was dead silent, except for that whispering, which seemed to come from every direction at once. The whispers seemed familiar. They echoed through my mind, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. And then there was a sound, a low scraping, like something dragging across the floor behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight shaking in my hand, casting erratic shadows across the walls. But there was nothing, just the empty, dust-filled space. Yet the whispers grew louder, clearer. They weren't wind, they weren't the house settling. They were voices, human voices, and they were calling my name. I took a step back, my mind racing. I needed to leave, needed to get out of that place. But my legs wouldn't move. It was as if something had rooted me to the spot. Then, from the corner of the room, something shifted. I caught a glimpse of movement in the dark, a shadow that didn't belong. It was too fast, too fluid to be human. But it was there, watching me, waiting. The whispers grew frantic, rising in volume as the shadow slowly approached. Get out! Get out! Get out. The words were barely audible, but they carried an urgency, a command that cut through the air. My feet finally moved, backing away toward the stairs, but the shadow was faster. It was right behind me now, its presence suffocating, like something from the darkest corner of my mind. The flashlight flickered. I gripped it tighter, my breath coming in short gasps as I scrambled up the stairs, my body aching with fear. And then, just before I reached the top, I felt it, a cold, clammy hand brushing against my ankle. I screamed, jerking my foot forward, nearly tripping as I reached the trapdoor. I shoved it open with all my strength, tumbling out of the darkness and back into the living room, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. The whispers stopped. The shadow disappeared, but the cold hand was still with me. I could feel it even now, like something that had never let go, never stopped following me. I didn't dare go back down there, couldn't, but the whispers, they didn't stop. At night, I would hear them, soft, distant at first, but growing louder, as if they were creeping up the stairs, getting closer, just beyond the trapdoor. I knew something was down there, something that didn't want to be found, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And maybe, just maybe, I would go back. I would go back to the whispers. Now, let's move on to story 9. That was only the beginning. What happened next would take me deeper into the mystery that I couldn't escape. It was a room that no one had ever mentioned. Not once in all the time I'd spent at the house. A room that didn't appear on the blueprints. Hidden behind a wall that seemed to have no reason to exist. And yet, there it was. The forgotten room. I had always thought of the house as just old. Its creaking floors and faint, dusty smells, the kind of place where secrets could easily hide in the corners. But this room felt different. It was one of those afternoons where the sun barely touched the windows, the air thick with the scent of rain that hadn't yet arrived. I had spent hours combing through the attic, pulling boxes of forgotten items out of the darkness. Old photos, trinkets, and dusty books. Things left behind, waiting to be remembered. But none of it was what I was searching for. Not until I stumbled across the oddest thing in the far corner. A piece of paper, wedged between two old boxes, yellowed with age. At first, I thought it was just another discarded note, but something about the handwriting made me pause. It was messy, hurried, as though whoever had written it didn't have time to be neat. The words were shaky, but clear enough to read. Do not open the door. It knows you. It has always known you. The message was simple, but it hit me like a brick to the chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for me, that it was a warning. But of what and why? My curiosity won out as it always did. I decided to investigate. The house, after all, had many strange rooms, secret places, areas that had long been abandoned. But there was something unsettling about this note. Something that told me I wasn't going to find the answers I was looking for, no matter how hard I tried. I began to search for the door mentioned in the note. At first, I had no idea where to start, but as I walked down the dimly lit hallway, I noticed something strange. A part of the wall near the end of the corridor seemed off. The wallpaper had been torn in one corner, and there was an odd indentation beneath it, like something was pushing from the other side. My heart skipped a beat. This was it. I ran my fingers along the edge of the wall, tracing the seam where it met the floor. Then, with a deep breath, I pressed my palm against the wall and pushed. It gave way with a low creak, and the wall shifted, revealing a small, narrow door behind it. A door I had never seen before. The door was old, its wood dark and warped, as if it had been there for centuries. It didn't look like it belonged to the rest of the house. There were no markings on it, no handle, no keyhole. Just smooth wood and a heavy, suffocating silence. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovering just above the surface. The warning from the note echoed in my mind, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. I needed to know what was behind it, couldn't let it go. With a sharp inhale, I pressed against the door. It didn't open immediately. I had to push harder, my whole body leaning into it, until with a reluctant groan, the door cracked open just enough for me to slip through. What I found on the other side was nothing short of wrong. The room was small, barely larger than a closet, but it was packed with objects. Old furniture, broken mirrors, empty picture frames, and strange relics scattered haphazardly across the floor. The air was thick, heavy with dust and something darker, something ancient. It was as if the room had been untouched for decades, its purpose lost to time. I stepped inside, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the room. And that's when I saw it, the thing that made my blood run cold. A mirror, but it wasn't like any mirror I'd ever seen before. The glass was dark, almost black, and the frame was ornate, twisted with strange symbols that seemed to move when I looked away. I didn't want to get any closer, but I couldn't stop myself. Something about the mirror, something about it drew me in. I stepped closer, my reflection hazy at first, but then clearer, sharper, as if it were pulling me in. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and as I touched the glass, I felt it. A coldness that seeped into my skin, deeper than any chill I'd ever experienced. The mirror didn't just reflect my image. It showed something else. A face, or rather a figure standing behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the clutter. But when I turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there, its eyes locked onto mine. A chill ran down my spine as I stumbled back, my chest tight with fear. I needed to leave. I turned to the door, but it wasn't there. The space was just a wall now, smooth and featureless. The mirror seemed to be pulling me back in, urging me to look deeper, to understand the horrors it held. The whispers started again, soft at first, but rising in volume. They were speaking to me now, clearer, louder, and they were coming from behind the mirror. Look deeper. You know what lies inside. It knows you. It has always known you. I tried to back away, but I couldn't move. My feet felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The whispers were surrounding me now, their words twisting in my mind. My head was spinning, my thoughts fractured as I tried to break free. And then I heard something else. A voice, not from the mirror, but from somewhere deeper within the walls of the house. A voice that sounded familiar. You shouldn't have opened the door. The voice was quiet but unmistakable. It was a voice I had heard before from my childhood. A voice I had long since forgotten. My grandmother's voice. The ground beneath me began to tremble, and I realized with a jolt that I wasn't alone in the room anymore. Something was moving behind me, slowly, deliberately. I didn't dare turn around. Couldn't. And then the wall behind me shifted. The mirror cracked. Now let's move on to story 10. That was only the beginning. The shadows from the forgotten room were just a taste of something far darker that was waiting for me. And now, I was about to uncover a curse that no one had dared speak of. The wind howled through the trees, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo across the empty valley. Hollow Creek had always been a place of mystery. Hidden deep within the woods, it was a small town that barely made it onto any map, and even fewer people visited. But I had to go there. Something had drawn me, some strange pull I couldn't resist. I had heard whispers about the creek all my life, but I never imagined I would find myself standing at its edge. The town's only real landmark was the old bridge that spanned the creek, a decaying structure that looked like it could collapse at any moment. Beneath it, the creek churned violently, its water dark and murky, as though it was hiding something. I hadn't meant to go to Hollow Creek. It was supposed to be a detour, a brief stop on my way to somewhere else. But once I got there, I couldn't leave. Something about the place, it wasn't just eerie. It felt wrong, like the land itself had been tainted by a curse that no one dared speak of. The locals had always been tight-lipped about the creek. Whenever I tried to ask about it, they would give me wary looks and change the subject. But there was one person who seemed willing to talk, an old woman who lived in a ramshackle house at the edge of town. Her name was Agnes, and she was known for her strange, rambling stories. People avoided her, but I figured she might know something. I knocked on her door one late afternoon, my curiosity getting the better of me. Agnes opened the door slowly, her eyes piercing through the darkness of her house. She looked me up and down, as if she could see into my soul. "You've come for the story, haven't you?" she asked, her voice rough, like gravel being scraped together. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded, unsure of what I was getting myself into. She beckoned me inside. Her house smelled of something old, dust, mildew, and the faint scent of something decayed. The walls were lined with shelves full of strange trinkets, jars filled with dark liquids, old books, and odd objects that seemed to hum with energy. "You want to know about the creek, don't you?" Agnes asked, her eyes glinting with an unsettling light. "Well, it's not just a creek. It's a place of power, a place of death. The curse started there, and it's never left." I sat down across from her, my heart pounding in my chest. "It was years ago," she began, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Long before anyone moved here, there was a family, the Holloways. They lived right by the creek, on a plot of land that no one would dare touch now. The creek was always there, but it was different then. It was clearer, calmer, and people came to bathe in its waters, thinking it could cure what ailed them." She paused, her hands trembling as she reached for a cup of tea. She didn't seem to notice the way the shadows in her house flickered unnaturally. Anyway, the Holloways were prosperous at first, but they made a mistake. They disturbed something. The creek is a boundary, you see, and when they built their house too close to the water, they broke the barrier. The land started to change. Crops stopped growing, animals started to disappear, and the air itself turned cold, even in the summer. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on her. "But the worst part," Agnes's voice dropped to a near whisper, The worst part was that the creek didn't just claim their land, claimed them. One by one, the Holloway family started to disappear, leaving nothing behind but their names carved into the trees along the creek. Every night, a different member of the family would vanish. No trace, no struggle, just gone. The room seemed to grow colder, and I could feel the air pressing against me. Agnes continued, her voice growing more strained. Then, one night, the last of them, the father, Thomas Holloway, stood by the creek, calling out to the waters. They say he made a bargain with whatever dark force lurked beneath the surface. A bargain to save his family. But it cost him everything. When morning came, all that was left was the old house, standing empty, and the creek, its waters darker than ever. I swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on me. After that, she said, her eyes narrowing, no one dared come near the creek. But the curse didn't end with them. It spread. It attaches itself to anyone who dares to come too close. You felt it, haven't you? The pull. It's not just the creek that's dangerous. It's the land around it, the very earth beneath your feet. Calls to you. I stood up, a sense of dread crawling up my spine. And if I go there, if I go to the creek? I asked, my voice shaking. Her eyes darkened. Then you'll know the truth. But you won't like it. The curse doesn't let go once it has you. It will haunt you forever. I left her house with a heavy heart, unsure of what I had just heard. But I couldn't ignore it. The pull of the creek, the mystery of the Holloways, it had become too strong. I had to see it for myself. That night, I walked down the road to the old bridge, the wind howling around me, as though it were warning me to turn back. But I didn't. I crossed the bridge and followed the narrow path toward the water. The trees seemed to close in on me, their twisted branches reaching for the sky like fingers. When I reached the water's edge, I stopped. The creek lay before me, its waters dark and still, almost as if it were waiting for me. I could feel it. The air was thick with something malevolent. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, pulling me closer to the edge. And then I heard it, a voice, a whisper, low and chilling, coming from the depths of the creek. You shouldn't have come. The world around me seemed to darken. The trees, the ground, everything blurred into shadows. The creek itself seemed to rise, its waters crashing violently, pulling at my legs, dragging me toward the edge. I fought against it, but it was useless. The force from the water was too strong. And then, as I struggled to keep my balance, I saw something in the water, something reaching out toward me, a hand. Now, let's move on to story 11. That was only the beginning. The darkness of the creek had already taken its toll on me, but what happened next would push me further into a madness I couldn't escape. I don't know how I made it out of the creek that night. One moment, I was standing at its edge, frozen by the eerie whisper in the water, and the next, I was back in the small town of Hollow Creek, panting, my heart racing in my chest. The wind had stopped, and the trees around me were unnervingly still, as if the entire world had paused. It felt as though I had been pulled into another reality, one that didn't belong to the world I knew. I was disoriented, my feet unsteady as I stumbled down the path toward the town. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad dream, that the strange happenings at the creek were nothing but a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something deeply wrong with this place, something ancient and unforgiving. The following days passed in a haze. I couldn't shake the feeling that the town was watching me. The locals seemed even more distant than before, and every time I tried to ask about the creek or the Holloway family, their faces would fall into tense silence. It wasn't just the people, though. There was something in the air itself, an unsettling weight that pressed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't until I met Lila that I started to make sense of what was happening. Lila was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with an air of quiet sadness that seemed to follow her like a shadow. She worked at the only cafe in town, a small, dimly lit place that smelled of coffee and stale bread. I hadn't meant to strike up a conversation with her, but something about her presence pulled me in. She was the first person to speak openly about the curse of Hollow Creek, and once she started, she didn't stop. "I've seen the trees move," she said one evening as I sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. Her voice was soft, barely audible above the hum of the cafe, but there was an urgency to it that made me lean closer. I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a trick of the light. But it wasn't. The trees, they whisper. I stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or shudder. "What do you mean, they whisper?" Lila's eyes darted to the window, as though she expected to see something out there. "It's not the trees themselves. It's something in the woods. The trees, they carry the voices. They tell stories, and they're always watching." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What stories?" Her gaze shifted to the doorway, as if she could sense something just beyond the threshold. "They tell the story of the curse. The Holloway family, the creek, everything. The trees know what happened, and they want to make sure it never goes away. That's why the people who live here never leave. They can't. The trees keep them here." I swallowed hard, the words settling in my chest like stones. "What does that mean? What does it want with me?" Lila's face tightened. "It wants you to listen. You have to listen to the trees, or else—" Her voice trailed off, and I knew better than to ask her to elaborate. I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear I had seen in the eyes of everyone else who lived in this cursed town. The next night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my room, the shadows in the corners of my vision flickering like they were alive. The whispers had started again, but this time, they weren't just in my head. I could hear them, faint, indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. I tried to ignore them, to pull the covers over my head and shut everything out, but the whispers grew louder, more persistent. "Go to the trees. Come back. Don't leave us." I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go. Whatever this was, it wasn't just in my mind. Something was calling me, pulling me into the woods. I grabbed my jacket, my hands trembling as I pushed open the door and stepped into the night. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. No crickets chirped, no wind blew through the branches. It was as if the world was holding its breath. I walked toward the edge of town, my footsteps muffled by the thick, damp earth. The trees loomed ahead of me, their gnarled branches twisting like fingers reaching for the sky. As I entered the woods, the whispers intensified, swirling around me, getting louder and clearer. The sound was coming from all directions now, rising and falling like a chorus. Some voices were soft, others sharp and demanding, but all were urgent. Listen to us. Find the truth. Save them. I felt a pull in my chest, an invisible force that seemed to draw me deeper into the forest. I couldn't resist it. The trees closed in around me, their branches arching overhead like a canopy. And then I saw it, a clearing bathed in an eerie, pale light. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk twisted and knotted like the veins of an ancient beast. The air around it was thick, charged with an energy that made my skin tingle. I could feel it in my bones, the presence of something old and powerful. The whispers stopped as I approached the tree, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, not from the air, but from within the tree itself, spoke to me. "Do you hear us?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was deep, echoing within my mind. It was the voice of the creak of the curse. It was calling me. "I hear you," I whispered, my voice trembling. The tree groaned, its branches creaking as though it were stretching, waking from a long slumber. "Then you must understand," the voice said. "The curse is not over. It will never be over until you free us." I took a step back, my mind racing. "Free you? How?" "You must listen," it said. "Listen to the trees. Only then will you know what must be done." The words were a riddle, one I couldn't quite understand. But the tree was right. Whatever had brought me here, whatever force had awakened in the woods, was tied to the curse. And it wasn't just a story. It was a living, breathing nightmare that had been waiting for me to discover the truth. I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered just inches from the tree's bark. But before I could touch it, a flash of light filled the clearing, blinding me for a moment. When my vision cleared, the tree was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there at all. The whispers returned, but this time they were frantic, desperate. "Go now, before it's too late." I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest, the whispers chasing me through the dark woods. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches clawing at my clothes, urging me to stay. But I couldn't. I had to leave. Whatever was happening, it was beyond me now. The curse had found me, and there was no escape. Now, let's move on to story 12. That was only the beginning. The woods were only a prelude, a whisper in the dark that had led me down a path I couldn't turn away from. What awaited me next would tear the veil between the living and the dead, and I wasn't sure if I'd make it through. I couldn't get the image of the tree out of my head, its twisted form, its voice, the sense that it was more than just a piece of nature. It lingered in my thoughts, haunting me. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was all some bizarre nightmare, I couldn't escape the feeling that the curse of Hollow Creek was far from over. The town seemed different now. The air was colder, and the people's eyes, once curious or wary, now held something darker. It was as though they knew something I didn't, something that had already been set in motion, something I couldn't stop. The town's old mansion, the one that loomed on the hill just beyond the edge of town, had always been a source of gossip. It was said to be abandoned, yet the lights sometimes flickered at night, and strange sounds echoed from its windows. No one dared approach it, not even the bravest of Hollow Creek's residents. But one evening, as I walked through the deserted streets, I found myself standing at the base of its long, crumbling staircase. There was a pull, a compulsion in the air that seemed to draw me toward the mansion. The whispers had been silent for the past few days, but I could feel their presence again, lurking in the shadows. I took a breath and climbed the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The door creaked open without resistance, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and decay filled my lungs. The mansion had seen better days. Its once grand architecture now sagged under the weight of time. As I wandered through the hallway, I found a room with a large portrait hanging on the wall. It was an oil painting, old and worn, of a man and woman dressed in clothing that seemed to belong to another era. Their eyes, sharp, calculating, stared back at me, their gazes following my every move. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the portrait. There was something unsettling about it, something I couldn't place. The couple's faces were distorted in a way that made them look unnatural, like they were trapped within the frame, their expressions frozen in time. I reached out to touch the painting, my fingers brushing the cold surface of the canvas. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over me, and I stumbled back, my heart racing. The room seemed to shift around me, the walls closing in as the whispers returned, louder this time. "You shouldn't have touched it." The voice was deep, almost like a growl, coming from somewhere in the room. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew frantic, echoing in my ears as the room seemed to pulse with energy. "Leave now." I turned and ran, my legs trembling beneath me as I fled down the hallway and out of the mansion. But as I stepped back into the cold night air, I realized something had changed. The mansion, it was still there, but its presence had shifted. The oppressive weight of it hung over me, pressing down on my chest as if it were alive, watching, waiting. I didn't know what I had stumbled into, but I knew I couldn't escape it. The portrait had somehow tethered me to the house, and the curse that had haunted Hollow Creek for generations was now wrapped around me like a vice. The whispers followed me, relentless, always just beyond my reach. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sound of footsteps outside my window, soft, deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my door. My heart thudded in my chest as the door handle slowly turned. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen, but the door remained still. The footsteps faded into the night, and the house fell silent once more. The next morning, I returned to the mansion, driven by an unseen force. I needed answers, and I knew the only way to get them was to confront the portrait again. The air inside was even heavier than before, and the hallway seemed longer, darker. The portrait was exactly where I had left it, but this time there was a subtle difference. The man and woman in the painting, they weren't smiling anymore. Their eyes were filled with something else, something darker. As I stood there, frozen in place, I realized they were no longer just a painting. They were alive. Their eyes followed my every movement, and their lips curled into a twisted, malevolent smile. "Welcome," the man's voice said, though his lips didn't move. "We've been waiting for you." The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in tighter and tighter until I could barely breathe. I stepped back, panic rising in my chest, but the whispers grew louder, more urgent. "You can't leave. You belong here now." Suddenly, the air was thick with cold, and the lights flickered. I turned to run, but the hallway stretched endlessly before me. I felt trapped, cornered by the curse, the house itself turning against me. My only escape was to face the portrait, the strange couple who had somehow ensnared me in their web. But as I moved toward it, my body unwilling to obey my mind, I heard the whispers again. "You don't understand. The curse never lets go. Once you see it, it takes you. It owns you, and it will never release you." I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing in my chest. I had come here seeking answers, but all I had found was more confusion, more fear. The mansion was alive in ways I couldn't explain, and its grasp on me was tightening with every passing second. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. The whispers followed me. The man and woman's eyes burned into my soul, and I knew this was just the beginning. The mansion, the portrait, they had all been waiting for me. Now let's move on to story 13. That was only the beginning. The mansion's curse had latched onto me, but there was more waiting in the shadows. Something far older, far darker than I could have imagined. The whispers weren't the only thing following me, and I would soon find out that the past I thought I had escaped was only the start of a much deeper nightmare. It was in the quiet of the night that I first saw it, a reflection out of place in the mirror. I had been sitting in the dimly lit room, the shadows stretching long against the walls, when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the flickering candle casting strange shapes in the room. But as I leaned in closer, I saw it. There was a shadow behind me, standing still in the reflection. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. Only the faint glow of the candles illuminated the walls, casting long, twisted shadows that danced with the breeze. I couldn't explain it. There had been something there, something watching me. I moved to the mirror, my hand trembling as I touched the cool glass. There was no sign of anything strange. The room was as it should have been, the reflection, a perfect replica of the space I was in. I was alone, or so I thought. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of the shadow in the mirror haunted me, lingering in the back of my mind. I kept seeing it, that dark shape standing motionless behind me, its presence undeniable. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, a piece of something sinister that had slipped into my world without warning. I sat in front of the mirror for hours, staring into the glass, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The reflection remained unchanged, a perfect image of the room and myself. Yet, the air around me felt charged, as if something unseen was breathing down my neck, waiting for the right moment to make its move. It was only after the clock struck midnight that I finally saw it again. The shadow, tall and gaunt, stood in the corner of the mirror, just out of the reach of the candlelight. It was darker than the surrounding shadows, its edges blurring as if it were made of smoke. And then, slowly, it began to move. I froze, my eyes locked on the reflection. The shadow shifted, drawing closer to the mirror's edge. I could feel it, its coldness creeping across the glass, its presence pressing against my chest. I tried to look away, to turn around and confront whatever it was, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, my breath shallow, my heart racing. And then, as if it had been waiting for me to acknowledge it, the shadow spoke. "Why did you come here?" Its voice was low, guttural, like the sound of wind howling through an empty corridor. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I was trapped, caught in the gaze of something that wasn't supposed to exist. The shadow's form shifted again, its outline flickering like a dying flame. It seemed to be circling me, growing larger, more defined, until it stood right behind me in the reflection. I could feel its presence now, close enough to touch. Yet when I reached out, my hand passed through the mirror as if it were nothing more than mist. The shadow leaned in, its face a featureless void, and whispered in my ear, "You should have never come. The mirror is a prison, and once you see it, you are bound." A wave of panic surged through me. I backed away from the mirror, my legs unsteady as I stumbled toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, the reflection of the room in the mirror changed. The walls seemed to melt, and the reflection of the door twisted, becoming an endless hallway. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood, tall, thin, its face obscured by darkness. The figure reached out toward me, its hand long and thin like a spider's leg, and I realized, with a sinking feeling in my chest, that the hallway wasn't just a reflection. It was real. I turned, frantic, looking for an escape, but the room around me was no longer the same. The walls were closing in, the ceiling lowering, the floor shifting beneath my feet. The mirror wasn't just reflecting my surroundings. It was pulling me into its depths, into a place where reality no longer held sway. I ran, heart pounding, my footsteps echoing through the strange, warped space. But no matter how fast I moved, the hallway stretched further, the figure at the end never growing closer, its hand reaching for me with slow, deliberate motions. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. Couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. The mirror's pull was relentless, dragging me further into its depths, until I felt my legs give out beneath me, my body collapsing onto the cold, hard floor. I reached for the mirror, my fingers grazing its surface, and for a moment, I thought I could escape. But then the shadow appeared again, standing behind me in the reflection, its presence overwhelming. I looked into its featureless face, and for the first time I understood. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, a portal to something far darker than I could comprehend. A place where the line between the living and the dead was blurred beyond recognition. And once you entered, you couldn't leave. The last thing I remember before I blacked out was the shadow's voice, whispering in my ear, "You'll never escape. Not now. Not ever." Now let's move on to story 14. That was only the beginning. The mirror had opened a door to something far more terrifying, something that had followed me since that first encounter. As I tried to escape one nightmare, I realized I was already entangled in another, something that would soon take me deeper into the darkness than I could ever have imagined. It had been days since I'd escaped the mirror's grip, but the terror hadn't left me. The shadow, its words still echoing in my mind, lingered like a dark cloud, overshadowing every thought. Every night, as I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but they grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from somewhere inside my own house. I tried to ignore them, convinced that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the remnants of my encounter with the mirror still fresh in my mind. But as the days passed, the whispers didn't fade. They grew stronger. Sometimes they sounded like my name being called softly from the other room. But when I went to investigate, there was nothing there, just the silence of an empty house. It wasn't long before the whispers started to follow me. They'd slip into the corners of my thoughts during the day, as if someone were breathing down my neck, waiting for me to turn around. At night, when I was alone in bed, the voices would rise in intensity, their words becoming sharper, more urgent. I could no longer tell if they were real or just the remnants of my fractured mind. But the fear in my chest told me they were something more. I couldn't take it anymore. That night, I decided to confront whatever was tormenting me. I couldn't allow the whispers to control me, to invade my thoughts and destroy my peace. I sat in the middle of the living room, the lights dimmed low, and listened. I needed to know where the voices were coming from. I needed to understand. At first, there was only silence. But then, faintly, like the rustling of leaves in a breeze, I heard it again. The whispering, my name soft and deliberate. Lila. I jumped, my heart racing. I stood up, my hands trembling as I searched the room. But there was nothing out of place. No one standing in the shadows, no one watching from the darkened corners. Just the quiet hum of the house settling, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. Lila. This time it was louder, more insistent. I felt the words vibrate through me, a chill crawling up my spine as the air grew cold around me. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the corners of the room, but all I could see was the dimly lit space around me. And then I saw it. In the farthest corner, where the shadows pooled thickest, something was moving. A shape, tall, thin, and dark, like a figure draped in a black cloak. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I watched, the shape shifted, its outline becoming more defined. It was moving toward me, its footsteps silent, as though it were gliding across the floor. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now. I could feel it pressing in on me from all sides, 1,000 voices whispering at once, all calling my name. Lila, Lila. I backed away slowly, my breath quickening as the figure drew closer. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my legs refused to move. The shape reached out toward me, its hands long and thin, like tendrils reaching from the darkness itself. Lila. The voice was no longer a whisper, but a low growl, a voice that came from the deepest corners of my mind. You cannot escape me. You are mine. The figure's hand touched my shoulder, and in that instant, the world around me seemed to disappear. The room was no longer the familiar space I had known. I was standing in a vast, dark void, the ground beneath me soft and squishy, like I was sinking into something. I looked around, but there was nothing, just the void, stretching endlessly in all directions. And in the distance, I saw it, a faint glow, like a candle burning in the darkness. But it wasn't a candle. It was a figure, cloaked in black, standing motionless, waiting for me to approach. As I took a step forward, The whispers grew louder until they were a roar in my ears. The figure's face remained hidden, obscured by the folds of its cloak, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. "Come closer, Lila," the voice called. But this time, it was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, an order I couldn't ignore. I took another step forward, my feet sinking deeper into the ground with each movement. The closer I got, the colder it became. The air was thick with something. I couldn't place it, but it felt wrong, unnatural. When I reached the figure, it turned to face me, its hand reaching out from beneath the cloak. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The figure's hand grasped mine, and in that moment, I felt something cold and sharp sear through my skin, as though the darkness itself had pierced me. The figure's face finally came into view, but it wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient, its features twisted and malformed. Eyes that burned with a sickly yellow light, skin that seemed to ripple like liquid shadow. It was not of this world. And then I heard it, the whisper, the voice that had been calling to me. "You are mine, forever." And before I could react, the world around me went black. Now, let's move on to story 15. That was only the beginning. What I thought was a mere shadow in the dark turned out to be something much more sinister. Something far worse was waiting for me just around the corner, in a place I thought I could escape to, a place where no one could reach me. But I was wrong. The darkness had found me again. It had been weeks since I'd first encountered the strange, otherworldly force that had haunted my dreams, pulling me deeper into its web with each passing night. I thought I had escaped it when I left the city and took refuge in Willowbrook Manor, a sprawling, old estate nestled in the rolling hills far from the chaos of the world. The manor was everything I had hoped for: solitude, peace, and a chance to start fresh. At least that's what I believed. The first few days were tranquil, almost too quiet. I reveled in the isolation, spending my time walking through the expansive grounds, taking in the beauty of the place, and getting acquainted with the creaky old house. The manor had been abandoned for years, left to decay in the shadow of its former glory. The once grand entrance now stood weathered and cracked, the once manicured gardens now overgrown and wild. But there was something about it that called to me, a peculiar comfort in its solitude. I told myself that this was what I needed, a fresh start. The house had a history, sure. Everyone around town knew the rumors, the whispers about the previous owners, strange disappearances, and the unexplained deaths that plagued the manor for decades. But none of that mattered to me. I wasn't superstitious. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. Couldn't have been more wrong. On the third night I first heard it. It was faint at first, almost like the wind rustling the trees outside. But when I lay in bed, it became clearer. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps that echoed through the long, empty hallways of the manor. I told myself it was just the house settling, the creaks and groans of an old building. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the louder the footsteps became, growing closer with each passing minute. I decided to investigate. I pulled on my robe and quietly stepped into the hallway, the cold wooden floors creaking beneath my feet. The manor seemed darker at night, the shadows stretching like living things. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled against the thick carpet as I made my way toward the source of the sound. The noise stopped just as I reached the staircase. I stood frozen for a moment, listening intently. Silence. It was as if the house had swallowed the noise whole. I looked up the staircase, the blackness of the upper floors swallowing any trace of movement. There was nothing there, but I felt it, something watching me from the darkness above. I turned and quickly ascended the stairs, my pulse quickening. The second floor was just as quiet, just as empty. I reached the end of the hall, where a large, ornate mirror stood against the wall. The glass was cracked in several places, but it still reflected the faint light from the hallway. I stared into it for a moment, feeling a strange pull toward it, before I turned away, dismissing it as nothing more than the remnants of the manor's decay. But then, just as I was about to leave the room, something caught my eye. In the reflection, I saw it movement, a shadow flickering across the floor, creeping toward me. I whipped around, but there was nothing, no one. I turned back to the mirror. The shadow was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. It was as if the house itself was alive, its walls breathing, its floors shifting beneath my feet. I couldn't shake the sense that something, or someone, was waiting for me, hidden just beyond the edge of my vision. That night I couldn't sleep. The footsteps returned, louder now, and this time, they were accompanied by whispers, soft, unintelligible words that seemed to float in the air, swirling around me like smoke. I could barely make them out, but I knew what they were saying. Get out. The words came clear, ringing in my ears, and the fear that had been building inside me reached its peak. I knew I had to leave, to run away from whatever had followed me here. But there was nowhere to go. The manor was miles from the nearest town, and my car had broken down the day I arrived. I was trapped. The next morning, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the manor. I had to know what it was, to understand why it had chosen me. I went into the library, searching through the old books and records that lined the shelves. That's when I found it. A journal, dusty and worn, hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers. The journal belonged to the last owner of the manor, a man named Thomas Bellamy. The entries were filled with strange accounts, obsessive ramblings about something lurking within the house, something that grew stronger with each passing day. He wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadows that moved on their own, and a growing sense of dread that consumed him. He mentioned a curse, one that had been passed down through generations of his family, tied to the very foundation of Willowbrook Manor. As I read through the journal, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his words. Thomas Bellamy had written about something much darker than I could have imagined, a force that had haunted the manor long before he had come to live there. He described it as an entity, a being that thrived on fear, growing stronger the more it was fed. And it had been feeding on him for years, until the day he disappeared without a trace. The final entry was the most chilling. It is not just in my head. It is real, and it will claim me as it has claimed all who have lived here before. There is no escaping it. No escaping Willowbrook. The journal ended there. I didn't know what to think. Was it all just the ramblings of a man driven mad by isolation? Or was there some truth to what he had written? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that everything that had been happening, the footsteps, the whispers, the shadow in the mirror, lined up with his story. Whatever had taken hold of Thomas Bellamy was now reaching out to me, pulling me into its grasp. I tried to leave. I ran out of the house, my mind racing with terror. But as I reached the front gate, I stopped. The path to freedom had vanished. The trees that lined the driveway were gone, replaced by a thick, impenetrable fog. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The world around me felt distorted, unreal. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, echoing through the fog. I turned to face it, but there was nothing, just the endless expanse of mist. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were coming closer. Now, let's move on to story 16. That was only the beginning. The fog I had encountered in Willowbrook Manor didn't seem to be a random occurrence. The longer I stayed in that house, the more I realized that the world I thought I knew was warping, bending around me like the edges of a dream. Something was changing within me. Something had already begun. It had been nearly a week since my terrifying experience at Willowbrook Manor, and I was convinced that I had escaped whatever force lingered within its walls. But, as with most things in life, escape was an illusion. I had moved back into the city, finding solace in the noise and bustle of everyday life, thinking that distance would ease the fear that still gripped my chest. But it didn't. The unsettling feeling was still there, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. And no matter where I went, the echoes of that cursed house followed me. The day after I left Willowbrook, I received a letter. It was an odd, official-looking envelope, addressed to me in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands. The letter contained only a single sentence. "You cannot escape what is already inside you." The words felt like a slap to the face, and I could feel the cold sweat prickling on the back of my neck. Who could have sent this? How did they know what had happened? My thoughts were spiraling, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly terrified. But I couldn't stay in this city forever. The nightmares had become more frequent, and I could no longer discern where the dream ended and reality began. The next night, I made the decision to return to Willowbrook Manor. I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the need to confront what had happened, or maybe it was the fact that the house, in some twisted way, had become a part of me. The curse that clung to its walls had taken root inside my mind, and I couldn't ignore the pull of the unknown any longer. I packed a bag with only the essentials: my jacket, a flashlight, and the journal I had found in the manor. The road back to the manor was eerily quiet, the world around me swallowed up by the endless stretch of darkened trees. As I neared the property, the air seemed to thicken, and I felt that familiar sense of unease creeping over me once again. The manor stood in front of me like a dark, hulking presence, its windows staring back at me like eyes. The fog had returned, wrapping the house in a dense, ghostly shroud. I could feel the pulse of something unnatural in the air, as if the very ground beneath my feet was alive. I didn't want to go inside, but I did. I pushed open the heavy front door, which creaked and groaned as it swung open. The interior was just as I had left it, if not worse. The dust had thickened, and cobwebs stretched across every corner. But there was something new, an overwhelming sense of presence, like an invisible weight in the air, pressing down on me. I stepped carefully inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sounds of creaking wood and the occasional gust of wind howling through the broken windows. I walked deeper into the manor, my footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust on the floor. The hallway stretched before me, long and narrow, lined with faded portraits of people I didn't recognize. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved past, a constant reminder that I was not alone here. I made my way toward the library, the room where I had found the journal. As I approached, I noticed something different. Something had been moved. The bookshelf I had searched through before was now slightly ajar, and a faint scratching sound emanated from behind it, like something trying to break free. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the shelf aside. What I found sent a chill down my spine. Behind the shelf was a narrow passage, hidden from view. The air in the passage was thick and stale, carrying the scent of rot and decay. The scratching sound was louder now, more urgent, like something trapped and desperate to escape. I turned on my flashlight and stepped into the passage, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The walls seemed to close in around me, and every step I took was heavier than the last. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to find it. The passage opened up into a small, dimly lit room. At first, I couldn't see much, but then my flashlight caught on something that made my blood run cold. There, in the center of the room, was a wooden box, carved with strange symbols I couldn't understand. The box was covered in dust, but the markings on it seemed fresh, as if they had been carved only recently. I approached the box, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching noise had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural hum, like the vibrations of something ancient and powerful. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the box. The moment my hand made contact, a shock of cold coursed through me, and the room seemed to shift. The shadows stretched unnaturally, creeping along the walls like living things. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then I heard it, a voice, soft, almost too faint to hear, but it was there, whispering from the corners of the room. You should have stayed away. Now let's move on to story 17. That was only the beginning. The whisper I had heard in the darkness was just a taste of what lay ahead. What I had uncovered at Willowbrook Manor was far deeper and darker than I had ever imagined. The echoes of the past were still alive, and they were calling for me. The next few days after I found the box in the hidden room of Willowbrook Manor were a blur. Couldn't sleep. The voice, the whisper, kept echoing in my mind, its words lingering like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. I tried to push it away, to pretend I hadn't heard it, but it was impossible. It felt as though the house itself was calling to me, like it wanted me to return, to finish whatever had been started. The problem was that the house wasn't finished with me, not by a long shot. I had returned to my apartment, but the quiet of the city no longer felt like home. The mundane sounds of traffic, people laughing, and footsteps on the sidewalk had faded into an unsettling background hum. It was as if I had been pulled out of my reality and thrust into another, where every corner seemed to hide something watching, waiting. I had left Willowbrook Manor behind, but it had left its mark on me. The journal I had found there sat on my desk, unopened for days. I couldn't bring myself to read it, not after what I had witnessed, but something told me that I needed to. I needed to know what the manor's history was, what had happened there to cause the house to rot from the inside out. I could feel it in my bones. The answers were hidden there. One evening, I forced myself to open the journal. The pages were yellowed, brittle with age, but the handwriting was clear, crisp, as if the words had been written just yesterday. I flipped through the pages, reading the entries, each one more disturbing than the last. The journal belonged to someone named Eliza, and from what I could gather, she had lived in Willowbrook Manor long before it became the crumbling wreck I had encountered. She described strange happenings, objects moving on their own, whispers in the night, shadows that never quite looked right. She spoke of a group of people, 4 of them, who had come to stay in the house. They called themselves the Forgotten Ones. At first, I thought it was some sort of metaphor, a group of people who had been ostracized or cast out. But as I read on, the true meaning became clear. The Forgotten Ones were not just outcasts. They were people who had been drawn into the house by forces beyond their comprehension. Eliza detailed how they had performed rituals, trying to unlock the secrets of the manor. But the house didn't give up its secrets easily. The rituals had awakened something. As I continued reading, the words became more frantic, more desperate. Eliza spoke of strange symbols carved into the walls, of rooms that didn't exist, of doors that led nowhere. She described the feeling of being watched, even when she was alone, and the sudden, bone-chilling cold that would sweep through the manor at night. And then the entries stopped. The last page of the journal was blank, save for one line written in the same trembling hand. I am one of them now. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Eliza had become one of the Forgotten Ones. She was still there, somewhere within the walls of the manor, and I had unknowingly joined them. I had been marked by the house. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. I had to go back. I had to understand what was happening to me. I returned to Willowbrook Manor that night, the city's lights fading behind me as the shadows of the trees loomed larger with every passing mile. This time, I didn't hesitate at the front door. I pushed it open, and the familiar chill greeted me, the same sense of wrongness that I had felt before. But this time there was something different. There was a presence in the house, one that I couldn't ignore. I moved through the hallways, my footsteps slow, deliberate. The manor was even more oppressive than before. The walls seemed to pulse with something alive, and every creak of the floorboards sent a shiver up my spine. But I was determined. I had to find the Forgotten Ones, find out what had happened to Eliza, and what it meant for me. I retraced my steps to the hidden room where I had found the box, but as I reached the entrance to the passageway, I froze. The scratching sound I had heard before was back, only this time it was louder, sharper. It was coming from behind the walls, from all directions, as if the house itself were trying to break free. I stepped inside the passage and moved quickly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the same symbols I had seen before. The box was still there, untouched, but the air around it was thick with something that shouldn't have been. I reached out, but before my hand could touch the box, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling into a hidden cellar beneath the house. The air was thick with dust, and the room smelled of rot. As I scrambled to my feet, I realized I wasn't alone. Figures stood in the shadows, their faces obscured, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They were the Forgotten Ones. "We've been waiting for you," one of them said, its voice like a rasping whisper. "It's time to join us." Now let's move on to story 18. That was only the beginning. The dark figures of the Forgotten Ones had welcomed me into their world, but the terror was far from over. They weren't just spirits trapped in the house. They were something much darker, bound to the very fabric of Willowbrook Manor. Their eyes, glowing faintly, burned with a hunger that would not be quenched. And I was becoming one of them. The hollow was suffocating. I was deep underground, deeper than the house's foundation, a place even the manor's decaying walls couldn't reach. I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on me, and the darkness seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like the heartbeat of something alive. I stood, trembling, in the cellar, surrounded by the figures of the Forgotten Ones. They had no faces, only hollow, black voids where eyes should be. The silence between us felt heavy, thick with a dread I couldn't shake. I could feel their eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. "Why are you here?" one whispered, its voice cold and distant, like it was coming from far below the earth. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. I didn't mean to intrude. I'm just trying to understand. "What happened here?" The Forgotten One before me tilted its head, its form flickering like a shadow caught in the wind. "You are already a part of it now." Its voice echoed in my mind, each word vibrating through my skull. My heart raced. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. I had felt it before. Something inside me shifting, pulling, as if I were being drawn into the very darkness that surrounded me. "We were once like you," another voice said, low and raspy, curious, seeking answers. But the hollow, it does not give answers. It only takes. I didn't understand. What hollow? What was this place? The first figure stepped closer, its form more defined in the dim light of the cellar. It reached out a hand. No, not a hand, but a twisted, misshapen mass of fingers, like something born from a nightmare. I recoiled instinctively, but it didn't seem to care. It was already too late for me. "You have already entered the hollow," it whispered. "This place, this thing, it has no beginning, no end, only whispers, and you will never leave." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. A hollow, place with no beginning, no end. The manor was more than just a house. It was a gateway to something darker, a prison of shadows that swallowed the souls of anyone who dared to enter. The Forgotten Ones began to move, their forms blurring and shifting like smoke in the wind. I couldn't tell if they were walking or floating. Either way, they were getting closer, closing in around me. I stepped back, my hand brushing the cold stone wall behind me. My mind raced, desperate for a way out. But there was no exit, no door, no windows. The hollow had trapped me, just as it had trapped them. "You cannot escape," one of them said, its voice echoing in my mind. "You are one with us now, and the hollow will never let you go." The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath in the dim light. I was shaking now, not from fear but from something deeper, something inside me that was starting to change. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin, clawing at the inside of my chest. "It is happening," another voice said, this one softer, almost sympathetic. "The hollow has already begun its work." I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the images, no, the feelings were overwhelming. I saw flashes of memories that weren't mine, dark, twisted visions of the past. I saw the faces of people who had once lived in Willowbrook Manor, their bodies contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. They had all been drawn into the hollow just like me. I opened my eyes, but the figures were gone. The cellar was empty. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out? Run? But there was nowhere to go. The hollow had already taken me. It was too late. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the darkness. You will find the truth in the hollow, but beware. It is not what you think. I turned to see the shadow of a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light of the manor above. It was Eliza, the woman whose journal I had read, the one who had become part of the forgotten ones. She stepped forward, her form flickering like a shadow, her face a blur of shifting darkness. But her eyes were still there. They glowed faintly, just like the others. Eliza, I whispered, my voice barely audible. She tilted her head, a slight, eerie smile forming on her lips. You think you understand, don't you? You think you've found the truth, but you're just another lost soul. The hollow doesn't let anyone leave. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. It was as though the walls of the hollow were closing in, suffocating me. My heart pounded, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around me, wrapping around my mind. The hollow is endless, Eliza continued, her voice barely more than a whisper now. And once you're in, you're part of it. Forever. Her form began to fade, her face disappearing into the darkness. But you will learn, her voice echoed, you will learn the true nature of the hollow. With that, she was gone, and I was left in the suffocating silence. I tried to move, tried to run, but something inside me had already changed. I could feel it crawling through my veins, something darker than fear, something older than anything I could comprehend. And the whispers, they were louder now, more insistent. I was never leaving. Now let's move on to story 19. That was only the beginning. The hollow had already claimed me, twisting my very being into something darker. But as I ventured deeper into this unending nightmare, something new called to me, a forgotten place, a new terror. The crawling shadows were waiting for me, and they weren't like the forgotten ones. I stood before Rookwood Manor, my heart hammering in my chest. The place had been abandoned for years, or so I had heard. But the feeling in the air told me something far more sinister was at play. The winds howled through the trees, carrying with them a faint whisper that seemed to call my name. You shouldn't be here, it seemed to say. I stepped closer, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. The once grand estate loomed in the distance, its towering spires reaching into the cloudy sky like the fingers of some great, twisted beast. The windows were dark, their panes cracked and streaked with grime. The door stood slightly ajar, as though inviting me in, and yet the air around the house seemed to pulsate with a warning. The crawling shadows had always haunted this place, and I knew deep down that I was about to encounter them firsthand. I hadn't come for this. I hadn't come for more horrors or mysteries, but the hollow had other plans. It had whispered its demands to me, pushing me toward Rookwood Manor as though it knew what awaited me inside. And despite every bone in my body telling me to turn back, I couldn't. It was as if the shadows inside had already begun to claw at my mind, pulling me closer with every step. As I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped sharply. The once ornate foyer was in disarray. The chandeliers hung crooked, and the once polished floors were covered in layers of dust and debris. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, their faded patterns resembling ghostly faces watching me from the corners. A pungent, musty scent filled the air, the smell of decay and rot, as though the house itself were slowly dying. And yet, there was something more, something unnatural in the air. The floorboards creaked and groaned under my weight, but it wasn't just the house that seemed alive. I felt eyes upon me, unseen but undeniably present, watching from the dark corners of the rooms. I stepped deeper into the manor, my hand brushing against the cold, cracked banister of the staircase. It felt like the house itself was alive, its walls breathing, its very foundation pulsing with some dark energy. I should have turned back. I should have never set foot inside. But something urged me forward, an invisible force pushing me into the heart of the manor. "Welcome," a voice whispered, so faint I almost couldn't hear it. I froze. My skin crawled as the sound of the voice seemed to come from all around me, filling the air like a suffocating fog. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but I couldn't help myself. The voice was both familiar and alien at the same time, the way it tugged at the edges of my mind like a memory I had long forgotten. I tried to speak, to demand an answer, but no words would come. The air was thick with tension, and my throat felt tight, as though the very atmosphere was choking me. It was then that I saw them. Shadows, dark as ink, began to move across the floor, slithering like living things. They were low to the ground, just beneath my feet, stretching and contracting with every movement. There were no shapes to them, no definite form, only darkness that crept and crawled, taking on the faintest outline of figures that shifted constantly. "They are waiting," the voice murmured again, this time louder, clearer. "The shadows never leave. They crawl." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. There was something deeply wrong about these shadows. They weren't just figments of the darkness. They were alive, sentient, and they were hungry. The shadows began to gather in the corners of the room, growing darker and denser as though drawn to me by some invisible force. I instinctively backed away, but no matter where I moved, the shadows followed, always just behind me, never letting me out of their sight. "You can never leave," the voice continued. "They will keep you here forever." I ran. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I bolted down the long, narrow hallway, my footsteps echoing against the cold stone walls. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the shadows. They were everywhere, closing in around me, their forms moving like liquid darkness, reaching for me with long, twisted tendrils. I turned the corner, breathless and panicked, but as I did, the hallway stretched endlessly before me, an impossible expanse of darkness that seemed to swallow all light. I was trapped. The crawling shadows surrounded me, moving closer with every breath I took. I could feel them wrapping around my legs, dragging me down, pulling me into the darkness beneath my feet. It was as if they were tethered to the very floor, the walls, the ceiling, and they were claiming me, 1 inch at a time. "You are ours," they hissed in unison, their voices melding into a single, unearthly whisper. The shadows tightened their grip, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate, the life being slowly drained from me. But then, in a flash of clarity, I realized the truth. I wasn't just trapped in the house. The shadows weren't just a force of darkness. They were the very essence of Rookwood Manor, bound to it, feeding off its decaying walls and its tortured past. I had come too far to turn back, too deep into the Hollow's grasp to escape. The shadows of Rookwood Manor were not just a part of the house. They were the house, and now they were a part of me. I opened my mouth to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The darkness closed in around me, and as I was pulled into its depths, I could feel my body shifting, changing, becoming part of the crawling shadows. It was too late. I had crossed the threshold, and now there was no escape. Now let's move on to story 20. That was only the beginning. Rookwood Manor had claimed me, twisted me into one of its own. But even as I became one with the crawling shadows, something else stirred. Something older, far darker, was waking up from the depths of time. The echoes of the forgotten tomb were calling to me, pulling me toward something unimaginable, a darkness that had waited for centuries. The wind howled through the desolate landscape, a mournful sound that seemed to mourn the dead. My footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunched through the icy ground as I trudged toward the ancient ruins. The forgotten tomb was said to be buried deep beneath the earth, forgotten by all but the shadows that watched over it. But I knew better now. The Hollow, the shadows, they had led me here, and in this place, something far worse awaited me than I had ever imagined. The tomb was ancient, its stone walls covered in the dust of ages, and yet there was an unmistakable sense of life about it. The air was thick with a stifling, oppressive weight, as though the very ground itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to awaken. As I stood before the entrance, I could feel the darkness reaching out to me, tugging at my very soul. The door, ancient and weathered, groaned in protest as I pushed it open. The sound was deafening in the stillness, an eerie warning that something was waiting inside. I stepped into the tomb, my every movement echoing in the cavernous space. The air was damp and cold, and the scent of decay clung to the walls like a long-forgotten memory. I felt the weight of centuries pressing down on me, the tomb's ancient walls watching, waiting for me to make my next move. And then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like the rumbling of an earthquake deep beneath the earth. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the very stones of the tomb shaking with it. It was then that I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They were the forgotten ones, the spirits of those who had been sealed within the tomb long ago. They were the echoes of the past, trapped in this cursed place, waiting for someone to set them free. I should have turned back. I should have run far away, but the Hollow had already claimed me, and I couldn't escape its pull. It whispered in my ear, its voice both soothing and terrifying at the same time. The tomb was no longer just a place, it was a prison, and I was its latest occupant. The shadows that surrounded me were no longer just specters of the past. They were living, breathing things, their forms shifting and changing, their eyes fixed on me with an unholy hunger. They had been waiting for me, waiting for someone foolish enough to enter their domain. The temperature dropped as I moved deeper into the tomb. The walls seemed to close in around me, narrowing the path until I was forced to squeeze through a narrow gap. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You should not have come," they hissed in unison, their voices carrying a sense of finality, as though the decision had already been made. I continued despite the terror that gripped me. I had to know what lay at the heart of this place. I had to understand what the hollow wanted from me. The deeper I went, the more the tomb seemed to change. The walls twisted and distorted, the floor beneath my feet shifting, as though the tomb itself were alive, trying to swallow me whole. The shadows crept closer, wrapping around my legs, pulling me deeper into the heart of the tomb. And then I saw it, a great stone altar, surrounded by the twisted forms of the forgotten ones, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The air around the altar shimmered with a strange, otherworldly energy, and I could feel its pull, drawing me toward it, forcing me to kneel before it. The altar was adorned with strange markings, symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I could feel the darkness seeping into my bones, filling my mind with ancient whispers and forgotten knowledge. The hollow was here, and it was stronger than ever. "You are ours now," the voices whispered, their words like 1,000 knives scraping against my mind. "We have waited for you." I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the altar. The moment my fingers made contact, the world around me exploded into darkness. The tomb, the shadows, the echoes, they all vanished, swallowed by an infinite void. I was falling, tumbling through the abyss, weightless and lost. And then a light, a faint glow in the distance, growing brighter and brighter until it consumed everything. I could hear the voices again, louder this time, their cries of triumph echoing in my ears. The hollow had won. The shadows had claimed me, and now the forgotten tomb had sealed my fate. I woke in darkness, my body cold and stiff. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the whispers still echoed in my mind. The tomb had claimed me, and now I was part of its eternal curse. The hollow had found its new home in me, and I could feel its influence spreading, growing stronger with every passing moment. The forgotten tomb was no longer forgotten. It had been awakened, and now it would never let go. Now let's move on to story 21. That was only the beginning. The shadows had found their way into the tomb, into the very core of my being. But even as I tried to escape, even as the darkness clung to my soul, something else lingered in the corners of my mind, something far more unsettling than anything I had yet encountered. The whispers behind the mirror were calling to me, and there was no escaping their reach. It had started as a simple task, a routine check of the old family estate. A house that, for years, had sat untouched, abandoned, shrouded in mystery. The kind of house you'd hear about in whispers, the kind you would never dream of visiting, let alone stepping inside. But I had no choice. The mirror was calling to me. I stood before it now, the ancient mirror that had been passed down through generations. Its surface was cracked, spider-webbed with age, yet still shimmering with an eerie light. The reflection I saw was not my own. Instead, there was someone, standing just behind me. First, I thought it was my imagination. The light had played tricks before, but as I blinked, the figure remained. It wasn't a person, but a shadow, a vague outline of something unfamiliar, watching me with eyes that weren't mine. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but the room was empty. The mirror reflected only my own disheveled appearance. There was no shadow, no figure, but the whispers had begun. They were soft at first, like a distant hum, a faint murmur carried on the wind. I thought I had imagined it, but the more I focused, the clearer they became. It was as if the mirror was speaking to me, coaxing me, beckoning me closer. Each word seemed to sink deep into my mind, like a poison slowly seeping into my veins. "Come closer," the voice whispered. "You know you want to know the truth." I took a step forward, hesitant but compelled. The air grew colder with each movement, a chill creeping into my bones. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was alive, pulsing with a life of its own. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were coming from within the very walls of the house. "You cannot escape. You are meant to be here." I froze. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, a presence, something that had taken root in the very fabric of the house. The figure in the mirror shifted, its outline becoming clearer. It was a person, but not quite human. Its face was distorted, as though it had been stretched and twisted, its eyes hollow and black, staring directly at me. I stumbled back, horrified, but the figure in the mirror did not move. It remained fixed in place, its gaze locked onto mine. "You are mine now," it hissed, its voice a rasping growl. "And soon you will understand the truth of this place." I tried to turn away, but my body refused to obey. The mirror had ensnared me, pulling me into its depths, trapping me within its reflection. My skin crawled as I felt the coldness of its gaze on me, the weight of its presence pressing down on me from every direction. The whispers were louder now, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. I could hear the sound of something scraping against the walls, the thudding of footsteps that weren't mine, the rustling of something moving just beyond my reach. "You cannot hide," the voice purred. "You belong to me now." I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the surface of the mirror. The instant I made contact, the world around me seemed to shatter. The reflection twisted, bending and warping, pulling me into the darkness within. My body was no longer mine, no longer in control. I was falling, spiraling into the depths of the mirror, into the void that awaited me. The last thing I saw before I was swallowed by the darkness was the figure. Its face twisted into a grotesque smile, its hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It reached out to me, its cold fingers brushing against my skin. "You will never escape," it whispered, its voice now a soft, cruel lullaby. "You are mine forever." I woke to find myself in the same room, the same house, but it was different now. The walls seemed to pulse with a sickly glow, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of unease. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence, but I knew they were still there, waiting, watching, lurking just beyond the edges of my perception. I rushed to the mirror, desperate to see if the figure was still there. But there was nothing. No shadow, no figure, just my reflection. But as I stared at myself in the mirror, something shifted. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker in the corner of the glass. A shape standing behind me, watching me with hollow eyes. It was only for a second, but it was enough to make my heart stop. The whispers returned, soft and insistent, like a distant melody played on the wind. "You belong to me," the voice murmured, its tone almost affectionate. "You always have." I turned around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, yet I knew, deep down, that I was not alone. The mirror had claimed me, and soon I would be nothing more than another whisper in its reflection. Now let's move on to story 22. That was only the beginning. The mirror had taken me, and I knew deep down that my soul would never be the same. But there was another house, another dark secret buried beneath the hill, hidden away from the world, called to me just like the mirror had, and something told me that my journey was far from over. I had been walking for hours, my feet aching beneath me as the moon cast a sickly light across the desolate landscape. I didn't know how I had ended up here, but it didn't matter. There was something that tugged at my mind, pulling me deeper into the wilderness, beyond the reach of reason. The path I walked on seemed to wind around the hill in unnatural ways, as if the earth itself was alive, bending to some unseen will. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches groaning and creaking like old bones. I had heard the rumors before, of course. The house beneath the hill, the one that no one dared speak of. The locals in the nearby town had all told the same story, about the strange noises that came from the hill at night, the disappearances, the cursed bloodline that had lived there for generations. They warned me to stay away, to never venture near the old ruins that lay hidden beneath the earth. But I couldn't resist. I had to see it for myself. As I reached the top of the hill, I saw it. A silhouette stood against the backdrop of the moonlit sky, a looming structure half buried in the earth, its edges jagged and broken like the bones of a long-forgotten giant. The house was half swallowed by the hill itself, its dark windows staring out like hollow eyes, empty and lifeless. I took a hesitant step forward, my breath catching in my throat as I approached the entrance. The door was ajar, creaking on its hinges as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. The air around it felt thick, heavy, as if something ancient and malicious was pressing down on me, suffocating me from all sides. I pushed the door open, the hinges squealing in protest, and stepped into the house. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, the walls lined with faded wallpaper that peeled away in ragged strips. The floors groaned underfoot, the sound echoing through the empty halls. I felt a chill run down my spine as I wandered deeper into the house, drawn by an invisible force that seemed to pull me toward the center of it all. The house felt alive, its presence oppressive, suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains in the breeze sent a shiver through me. It was as if the house itself was watching me, waiting for something. I made my way to the back of the house, where a set of stairs led down into the earth. They were narrow and steep, covered in a thick layer of dust. The air grew colder as I descended, the darkness pressing in from all sides. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a dimly lit room, the walls lined with old bookshelves that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with the smell of mold and rot, and the faint sound of something scratching against the walls echoed in the silence. I wasn't alone. I turned around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the walls, the shelves, and the heavy silence that filled the room. I reached out to touch one of the books on the shelf, my fingers brushing against the worn leather cover. It was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a book. It was something more, something that had been waiting for me. As I pulled the book from the shelf, a low growl echoed through the room. The sound was guttural, like the growl of some unseen beast, its voice thick with malice and rage. My heart skipped a beat, and I dropped the book, the thud of its fall echoing in the silence. A figure appeared in the doorway. It was tall, its face obscured by shadows, but I could feel its presence pressing in on me. The air grew colder still, and the growl deepened, now vibrating through the very bones of the house. The figure stepped closer, and I could hear its breath, ragged, uneven, like something that had been starved for too long. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "You should have stayed away." I took a step back, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, my mind racing, my thoughts tangled in fear. The figure stepped closer still, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I could feel its cold fingers brushing against my skin, its icy touch sending a shock of terror through me. "The house is ours," the figure hissed. "You are nothing but a trespasser." And then everything went black. I woke to find myself back in the house, but something was different. The walls were no longer covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air no longer stank of decay. The house had changed, as if it had shifted, becoming something far darker, far more twisted. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. The whispers were louder now, too, echoing through the hallways, coming from all directions. I couldn't make out the words, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was unmistakable. I made my way back to the stairs, but as I ascended, I noticed something strange. The walls, once empty, were now covered in strange symbols, symbols I didn't recognize. They pulsed with an unnatural energy, glowing faintly in the dim light. I reached the top of the stairs, and there, in front of me, was the door to the outside. But something stopped me. I turned around, drawn by the irresistible pull of the house's heart. The whispers were louder now, and they were speaking directly to me. "Stay," they murmured. "Stay with us. Forever." I turned back to the door, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving just beyond it. Something darker than the night itself. I could hear it now, the sound of heavy footsteps, the growl of something unseen. It was waiting for me,